All right, cool. So back again to continue Gilles Deleuze's Cinema 2, the time image. So now we're going to start from chapter 4, titled The Crystals of Time. So obviously go check out episode 1 on this book, and not especially, but if you want a little bit more background context, go check out the Cinema 1, the movement image, which we've done on here in pretty great detail. But for now, The Crystals of Time. Yeah. So, I don't know. Do you want to introduce yourself again? Should you? Yeah.
Probably. Yeah, probably for professional reasons. What if someone only wants to talk about crystals?
I don't know. Yeah, you're right.
Okay. I'm Christina Elle Burke, PhD candidate at the Center for Study of Theory and Criticism. Aspiring screenwriter. I do creative work. I do a lot of research. The cat's gonna make noises. I do all sorts of things. I'm an Film Studies Association of Canada award winner for an essay
That's right,
I wrote.
You didn't mention that.
I didn't mention that last time. It should have come up. Anyway, yeah, and I also love this book. If you listen to the last episode, you know that.
What was that? The award. What was the essay you wrote for it?
Yes. So, I don't remember the exact title. It has the word syneroticism in it, which is a sort of concept I was playing with as something that goes beyond cinephilia, but it's not nearly as hot and sweaty as Patricia McCormick's cinesexuality. It's more of a theoretical construct. And it was an essay about what we want from cinema now that our relationship to it has changed so much from what it used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds pretty great.
And I'm like super critical of film studies in it, so it's weird that a Film Studies Association gave me an award for it.
It sounds good. Sounds like it deserved it. But yeah, all right. So we're starting here from chapter 4, The Crystals of Time. And this is where I had no idea what the hell was going on. Really, like, no idea. Because crystals, to me, at this point, I didn't understand.
Okay.
I didn't get it.
So, let's talk about crystals. Crystals! Exclamation point. I love crystals. I love this chapter. I love this book, but I love this chapter in particular. So, when we think of a crystal, we probably think of some kind of jewel. Or we think of a sort of clear stone or glass.
That's what
crystal.
I thought.
Yeah. And that's really not wrong. But what we need to be thinking about is the reflections in a crystal and how a crystal sort of images enter into it when we look through it, and then they become different things. They take on different shapes. And so in the crystal, there's an indiscernibility between something that is and all the things it can become.
Right.
And so you have crystals that you can both see through clearly, crystals that are limpid, and then you have more opaque crystals where what you see is maybe there's some kind of gunk, to use a very academic word, on it, or it's not as, the light doesn't travel through it in the same way. It's stopped. And so the real thing to hit on here, though, is this idea of indiscernibility, particularly between the virtual and the actual, or as he puts it, between the real and the imaginary, or I guess what we can call, in some level, between the sort of sensory motor way of looking at things and then the possibilities of things, and that these two things, our ability to be able to distinguish between them falls away. And this is what happens in the crystal. We look into the crystal and all these things become possible. And then he goes on a bit of a diversion where he starts talking about the conspiracy of money.
Yeah, I made a note of that.
Yeah, and this idea that time is money. And he uses the example of Fellini's 8.5, where when
which I've seen. Of any of the movies in here, I think that's the only one I've seen.
It's a good one.
And The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I think he mentions, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so the movie ends, both the movie, as we're watching it, ends when the filmmaker's money runs out, but also his ability to work ends when the money runs out. And what Deleuze is getting at here builds on when he talks about the conspiracy of cliches, too, is that cliched cinema, it's always being put to use. So the money knows where it's going. We see the money and people consume it. They get what they want and more money goes into it and it lets itself be reproduced indefinitely. And I think what Deleuze is drawing on is that in art cinema and in oppositional kinds of cinemas, money is much more precarious. And so you have to imagine more with less. You have to get at things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. If you had the money to just make a sensory motor recreation of what you were trying to express, like, you could do that, but you don't, so you run out of money trying to make these movies. And I think there's a kind of quasi-Marxist sort of message going on here in Deleuze, where if we begin to think of images in terms of how they are exchanged, then images that don't neatly make an exchange, that don't fit into that hierarchy of exchange, have a sort of resistant quality or kernel to them. Mm-hmm. And crystals are sort of, I guess, the image that you take on to create different possibilities, and where you can sort of siphon and escape this conspiracy of money that demands things meet the sort of symbolic or sensory motor demand.
Right.
So I think that's why he brings that up here. I think it'll become more clear later on what he's getting at with the money conspiracy thing, and what he's getting at with the cliche, and how these things relate together. So moving on to the second part, he starts talking. We're getting more into our description of time, what time does. And so we encounter time here as subjectivity, virtuality, thought, affect, any space, whatever. And so we lose our sort of mooring in time. I really think of Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five here. I don't know if you've read it.
I have.
Yeah, that was a really big novel for me in high school, where the character becomes unstuck in time. That's the words Vonnegut uses to describe it. And so in a crystal, or in the crystals of time, what we see is time's movement in both directions. We see events from the present and events from the past going simultaneously in two directions through different lenses of the crystal. Things happen and they go multiple ways. And the key idea here is the shift to the notion that time isn't being produced by the things that we're doing. Time is something that exists outside of us that we partake in. And I kind of wish Ben was here, because this is the moment where he'd say, like, Deleuze is a real Kantian. Because Kant has this idea in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Transcendental Aesthetic, you can't think something if it's not in time.
Yeah, now I would add to that, when he's describing the shift from the movement image to the time image, he's describing a moment, and this is a moment he really ascribes to Kant, in which time is no longer subordinated to movement, when in fact suddenly we find movement can be subordinated to time.
Yeah.
And Kant certainly participates in that with the Transcendental Aesthetic, when he's like, essentially there are two media through which anyone can understand the world, and they are held pretty equally. In fact, space is only possible. The two media are space and time. Space is only possible because we have a sense of time. And it's in that way that we get this, subordination of movement through space by time, or to time, in relation to time, in my shitty reading of Kant.
Well, no, it's actually a good reading, because let's look let's step back and look at this project as a whole. You have cinema 1 and 2, you have movement and time, you have the antinomies between the movement image and the time image. I think there's definitely a kind of Kantian ghost at work here, though he's going to take Bergson as sort of his model. And at one point he says, well, Bergson is very Kantian here, but he would never admit it. And he says it's slightly different, but it's very similar in Bergson. And I think the difference in Bergson comes when it comes to the subject who perceives time and space. So for Kant, there's the sort of function of like the subject, whereas for Bergson, there's just images, and there's the movement image and the time image, and then the brain image that is going to work between them and towards them. And so again, because we can move in all directions, because we can occupy an image of time, because we can experience an image of time, again, there's this indiscernibility between what is real, what isn't, what is just a thought of something's possibility, what is actually being experienced. And he hits this again and again. Indiscernibility is the word. And in what is philosophy, he'll use the term zones of indiscernibility to describe what artworks do with their various becomings and things like that. So, yeah, this is the kind of shape he's taking up, and now we're moving into time images. And so the third section of the fourth chapter gives us different kinds of crystals. And gets very new agey. No. So we have perfect crystals, where he talks about Max Ophuls films. And so these are essentially like circuits. They don't point towards a future. They don't decay into a past. They are just perfectly shiny. We see into them, and the light goes through them and goes around them and is reflected on all sides. And as a description of Ophuls' films, it kind of suits them. I think Ophuls is more complicated than that. He's not as immaculate as Deleuze makes him sound. But that's a personal taste.
I have no dog in that race.
With Jean Renoir, we have cracked crystals, which is a crystal that opens out onto a future or a possibility, so that we go through these virtual actual indistinctions to then be able to make something of ourselves, or to deal with being in the world. I actually found a really good understanding of Renoir the other day, accidentally, because it wasn't about Renoir, it was about George Eliot.
Okay.
And it was just this idea that realism isn't just this objective sort of point of view. Realism also has a sort of self-care element. So what Eliot is trying to do isn't just to describe this hideous world of like low people, it's to like allow us to recognize these certain qualities of ourselves that we're not proud of, and like be able to live in them. Mm-hmm. And I think with Renoir, it's very similar, that you see these sometimes miserable, sometimes struggling people, characters who you recognize an almost pure humanity in, not a ideal, and then they learn to exist in the world as it is and as a part of it. And so, like, I think Deleuze's description of a crystal which occupies these two places but then opens out onto a greater possibility is really, really on point with Renoir.
Right.
And so then he talks about seeded crystals, which scientifically I can't explain to you. I don't know how crystals work with seeds or anything like that. Maybe someone does. Talk to me about crystals. I'd love to learn about crystals.
Leave a comment.
But yeah, and he talks about Fellini with this, and what he's getting across is that Fellini creates these worlds where there isn't this distinction between virtual and actual, but also it's not as situational as it is in Renoir or Ophuls, that the world is constantly building itself out of memories and things becoming indistinguishable from one another. And this is like 8.5, like those tracking shots where you see all these strange people. It's like, are these people real? Are they this character's imagination? What are we seeing? We just saw this character's imagination. Now are we still in it? Are we out of it?
Right.
Where are we? And it's just this world building up and all these reflections. And then the last kind of crystal he talks about are these decomposing crystals. Right. In Luchino Visconti's films, which The Leopard, if you haven't seen it,
no.
If you like The Godfather but wish it was more Italian and had nothing to do with crime,
what's left in The Godfather if you subtract those things, or if you subtract the crime?
A like
family
drama about these aristocrats in, I think it's in Sicily, correct me if I'm wrong, and how they deal with sort of the unification of Italy, and it's this real historical sort of film, but it's about someone who doesn't belong in this new present anymore, who's outside of it, and so they see that old world falling away, and so what comes to be indistinguishable is these values of the present, what they will become, and then also the world as they knew it and how it's going away. And so he travels into the crystal, but then the crystal ends up collapsing, and the movie sort of ends with the character taking his bow. And so yeah, those are the kinds of crystals.
I believe you. I really cannot emphasize how dense I am with this. Like, if you will look right here, my note was WTF is the crystal, because I couldn't like grasp it.
Yeah.
But you made it a lot clearer.
Yeah, I think when I think about it, I think of like a glass crystal, or I think of a rock crystal, or like a prism. And I just try to imagine something being reflected in it. Mm-hmm. And I think there is also a reference to like biomolecular crystals and crystallization going on here.
Sure.
Especially with the talk of like seeds in the environment. So it's like not just crystals in a sort of jewel sense or geological sense, but also an organic sense.
Yeah.
And I don't know how else to put that. I don't have the science words. But I remember my old supervisor trying to get me to do some stuff about biochemical crystals, and me going, where do I even start with this? What is this research? I'm a film girl. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you making me read about science?
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, so that's chapter 4. I really love the stuff about crystals because it's so strange. And this book's just going to get stranger. But just this way of seeing time in these kind of endless reflections and finding it in directors so varied from each other. Like, I don't think watching a Renoir film and watching a Fellini film are anything alike. I don't think you can compare them.
Yeah.
But the way he draws a sort of similar taxonomy out of them, and I think that's one of the parts of these books I've really come to appreciate this time around, is just like, it's about finding these images and what they attempt to relate and contain. It's just, it's so mind-blowing to me. And like, I find something exhilarating about it too. Like, it's almost its own science fiction in a way, the stuff about the crystals. Anyway, we can move on to chapter 5.
That sounds good to me.
Back to our boy Bergson.
Fourth commentary on Bergson.
We should save this drink to pour one out for Bergson when we're done with this chapter, because that'll be our last dance with Henri.
Yeah, that's right, huh?
Yeah. So now we get into direct time images,
which in his words, the crystal reveals a direct time image.
Yes. And so he starts talking about sheets of the past.
Right.
And he describes them as being like waves and overlapping. And we get this idea of the pure past, which is maybe one of the craziest ideas Bergson has, where we all have memories and we all have the past we know about and talk about for ourselves. But those things we talk about are what Deleuze and Bergson would call recollection images. They're parts of ourselves that we use. For Bergson, there exists this pure past that we've experienced, that those things are made out of, that we carry with us all the time. It's like an unconscious, but it's just this reservoir of possibilities of things we've experienced that we dive into to pull out recollection images, but exists as kind of this infinite sort of sea of history that's a part of us that we most of the time don't even know about or acknowledge. And we all have these pure pasts as individuals, but there also exists a general pure past of the world and in which we all take part.
Yeah.
And so there are all these sheets, both the memories we form and are conscious of and the pure past that we don't recall, and they all overlap with each other and with the world's past too. And so all these pasts are there with us all the time. All these pasts are happening now as a part of us, but we're not thinking about them.
Yeah.
And so what the time image is going to do is going to get us to dive in to these pure pasts and change from being a question of movement and surface to being a question of depth, to literally begin diving through all these layers of ourselves and the world and the characters in the films. When I say ourselves, that's what I mean 90% of the time, is the characters in the films.
Yeah. So, like, the way I understood this was that when we were watching, like, really old films, pre-World War II films, what we saw were characters that we didn't really care about. We cared about what they were doing at the moment. Whereas there was a point in which, post-World War II, where we suddenly became concerned not only with the histories of the characters themselves, but with the, histories of the spaces in which they were inhabiting and stuff. And that to me was how I very simplistically understood this association of the past with these immediate quote unquote present moments. I don't know if you can make me feel better about it and confirm what are my suspicions.
Yeah, I think what we become interested in is all of it. We become interested in the character's history and the history of the place and how they sort of collide with one another, and how this doesn't produce a reaction or an action, but it produces a pause or a moment to think, to describe, and we have to think of what is this relationship that's being presented to us between these two things? What is the character seeing, but what am I seeing them see? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so this is where time becomes thought, because it's in this pure past, in this virtuality, that new ideas come from through description.
Yeah.
So time and thought sort of take on an identity. They're not completely equal, but the experience of diving into time becomes thinking.
Yeah.
And so he uses Last Year at Marienbad as an example of this. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Last Year at Marienbad, and I used this book, and I didn't understand a word of it. I just picked out sentences that sounded good.
I'm in the second year of my PhD, and I have no idea what the hell this book was about. I wouldn't imagine in my undergrad trying to...
But seeing it now, where when you watch Marienbad, there's the location, which maybe Marienbad, maybe somewhere else. It's a fancy European resort. The decor is constantly changing. The architecture's changing. The garden's changing. You have a character approaching one another and saying, we met last year, it was here, you said this. And she's like, I don't remember, I refuse. And their memories are competing. The space becomes a giant memory in itself. And these all overlap with one another. And you don't know what is past, what is present, what is actual, what is possible.
Right.
Is it all a ghost story? Like, that's like the easy way out of it. Right, is to just be like, they're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he makes this comparison to the Franz Kafka short story Josephine the Singer, which I don't know
what. No.
Okay, so it's about a singing mouse.
Okay.
And there is these people, the mice gather around to hear Josephine sing.
Right.
But eventually she kind of disappears and she stops singing. And none of the mice know how to sing. And there's this constant question of, did this mouse ever sing? Who's heard of a singing mouse?
Yeah.
Like, even among us mice, who's heard of a singing mouse? Like, with art, like, I read Josephine the Singer as being about art, fundamentally. It's about aesthetics. Like, what is art when it exists for us? Like, does it last? Is it permanent? Or is it something that just comes out before us and we experience it and then it goes away?
Mm-hmm.
And so it has this very transient quality, and it's something that, like, when we remember it, we can't just pull up. We can't just make a recollection image out of our aesthetic experiences.
Right.
They're just a part of us, and we feel them, and we try and describe them, but we never...
Yeah.
We're never just going to be able to be like, well, I read this, and I'm going to use it for this.
Yeah.
Like, we do that because we're academics, but that's not the real point.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, after he brought up Josephine the Singer, which is one of my favorite short stories, I just wrote in brackets, I love this book. Like,
I want to read it.
Because I'm talking about cinema too. Like, this is like, he gets me. What he's saying is like, okay, when I get through the more difficult, like, okay, so how does, like, crystals work when they, like, form on mushrooms? Because is that the kind of crystal he means, as opposed to, like, what is it? When I get past that, and when I get, like, so, like, a sheet of the past, is that, like, a glacier? Is it, like, a wave? Or, like, is it, like, ice colliding with each other? Or, like, is it, like, just bed sheets rolling around? Could I, like, make a, like, art installation and call it Sheets of the Past?
Yeah.
And, like, when I get past that, and I get to what he's saying about the transience of art, about this pure past, about time as thinking and describing and trying to be in time, that's when I'm really responding to what's going on here. And I'm like, okay, yes, this absolutely makes sense. And the films you're drawing on fit really well.
Yeah.
And so in the second part, he talks about Wells as sort of the person who defines the direct time image. So Citizen Kane is the first direct time image. It's not like a proto-time image like an Ozu. It's not like neorealism, which will develop its wandering and the character of the seer. It's something that just comes out, and this is what the time image is going to be. And it's tied to sort of depth of field or sequence shots. So the famous scene Deleuze relies upon is when Susan, Alexander, Kane's mistress, tries to commit suicide. Our shot is through, like, her glass of pills, and she's lying in the bed, and then we see Kane himself in the background at the door, and he looks very small and helpless while she lies there big and suffering. And he comes in to see her, and there's no cut, there's no, like, reaction shot. It's all this long sort of take, and so Deleuze is going to argue this sort of movement, this diagonal movement through the scene, the characters moving across the screen rather than horizontally, is the start of, like, a pressure of time taking place in the image. And so this is sort of Wells's first major discovery. And then the other thing is that on the one hand, we say that Citizen Kane is famously a movie made up of flashbacks, It's about a reporter trying to figure out what Rosebud was.
Yeah.
But the innovation Wells makes is that Rosebud doesn't actually mean anything. We can say it stands for this, this, and this, but the film never says it. No one ever confirms it, and the reporter never finds out what Rosebud is. Only we know that.
Yeah. Yeah, the sled,
Yeah.
in case anyone was curious.
Yeah, what's the awful Family Guy bit? It's his sled! It's his sled! Don't bother!
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. But, so, the fact that these are these recollection images, the character's trying to use these flashbacks, trying to make sense of them, and just can't, is sort of, again, time asserting itself, that you can dive in and create all these descriptions out of the past, but you're never going to pull the thing.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to make absolute use of it.
Yeah.
And then, so in part 3, just to go back to Renee, we get these sort of memory worlds, or sort of films built out of competing memories. And I talked about Hiroshima Mon Amour earlier, where you have this woman who's remembering her trauma in Nazi-occupied France, and she's in 1960s Hiroshima with someone who lived through the bombings.
Mm-hmm.
And you have just these images that are summoned up out of nowhere, where the woman is walking on the streets of Hiroshima, and all of a sudden she sees her old French village just come out of them. There is no moment where she reminisces. It's just there all of a sudden. Like, the flashback is completely gone here. What remains is just, like, thinking. Like, places become other places in time. The world itself can call upon this pure past and present it to you in what it is. And to go back to the sort of famous Europa 51 example, the Rossellini film, where the woman looks at the factory and she sees prisoners. Like, it's this same principle that the films themselves are taking on a quality of thinking. They're making connections. It's not even metaphorical. Like, your brain doesn't work in metaphor. Like, metaphor is a product of speech and of writing. Your brain just associates images and summons them into each other. And so that's what he talks about with Renee, and he talks about with these memory worlds, and how Wells sort of started this off with, like, oh, we pull up memories and they don't do anything, but now memories just spring up. They're part of the space. And the space has a memory. We're almost in, like, Mallarmé territory of nothing will have taken place but the place. Yeah, so that's chapter 5. That's Bergson.
And that's the pour a drink out to Bergson.
Yeah, pour one out for Bergson. I really need some water after that.
Yeah, that was a good... You did a good presentation on that one for sure. Mm-hmm. It made sense to me, if that's any consolation.
That's good.
I mean, I will say, this is all still very confusing to me. And part of the reason is that I just don't understand... It doesn't help that I haven't seen most of these movies. Films. Yeah.
Movies are films. Look.
I like the colloquial element to movies.
Slight digression. I had a professor once who was like, you shouldn't write movie, you should write film. And I thought that was some bullshit. Just write movie. That's what they are.
Yeah.
These days, they're more movies than they are films anyway.
Yeah, they're not on a fucking, whatever the... What would you... The
projector.
They're distributed.
They're not on celluloid.
Yeah, exactly.
They're on hard drives. They're on big fancy hard drives.
Anyways, it doesn't help that I haven't seen a lot of these movies, so it made it difficult, certainly at times. Mm-hmm. The Citizen Kane I was there with because I'd seen that, but the rest of them, aside from Bicycle Thieves, 8.5, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, like I hadn't seen
the hits.
The hits. The big ones.
Yeah.
I see nothing else. So it's like, I don't know what you're saying, Deleuze. But anyways, yeah. So, chapter 6. The Powers of the False.
Okay. As Bergson goes, in comes Nietzsche. And so... Yeah, we're going to be talking about the powers of the false, the character of the forger, and falsifying narration, or characters deliberately lying to us, manipulating us. And he talks about the failure of semiology again, this time much more generally about semiology as a practice. He's like, look, this can't account for this because it insists on there being a certain order, and the character's utterances act against these orders, so there are competing levels, and it just doesn't work. Like, you need a pure semiotics, not a semiology, to understand cinema. And again, we get these are seers, not actors. They're people who are looking. They're people who are looking out to something and expecting it to... I don't know if they're expecting anything from it. That's the thing, is they just see something and they don't know how to deal with what they're seeing. And so, like, there's this idea of, like, a pure crystal that is... This chapter makes me think of, like, falsified, like forged jewels.
Okay.
Like... If the crystals earlier were, like, natural crystals,
sure.
like,
yeah,
uncut, these are, like, derived crystals, or, like, what's the word? Counterfeit crystals, or something. They're, like, cut gems. I don't know. Something like that. So these characters are always characters who are in production of themselves and of the world, and they're looking to produce out of this pure past. So if the other crystals were crystals that were somewhat organic in their nature, or they were formed as a result of... they were formed out of the past. These are characters reaching in and blending, of trying to take control of those pure pasts, or of trying to control the virtual, to use possibility. And so that's why, like, I think Orson Welles is, again, really big here, but this is going to be sort of like later Welles films. We see it in Kane. We can view the reporter in Kane as sort of like a forger. He's trying to make a story out of Rosebud, and he can't do it. He can only, like, find all these platitudes about, like, what is a life? You know, what is one experience? But then it's in films like Mr. Arkadin, which opens with the parable of the scorpion and the frog, where, you know, the scorpion wants to cross the river, so it asks the frog to take it across, and the frog's like, no, you're going to sting me. And it's like, no, I won't. I have to get across. If I sting you, we'll both die. And then, of course, the scorpion stings the frog, and they both die. And the frog's like, what the hell was that? And the scorpion goes, I'm a scorpion. It's in my nature.
I just know that from Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive.
Yes.
Like that.
I think Refn is maybe a bit of a Welles fan.
Yeah.
And yeah, so in Arkadin you have someone who's hired an investigator to find all these people who know about his past, and then he slowly eliminates them. He's trying to retell his own story. He's trying to take control of it and build his own narrative, but he fails to do so. There's always something that escapes him, and just the idea that his past exists outside of his control is enough to completely destroy him, because the film ends with this sort of plane chase sequence, and the main character threatens to tell Arkadin's daughter about his true history. And so the daughter ends up lying and says, he told me everything. Of course, he didn't tell her anything.
Yeah.
But that is enough for Arkadin to be like, to crash his plane and die, because it's just like, I couldn't control this thing. I tried to make this history out of myself, but it was beyond me. It was too much for me. And then from there we get to sort of, this is similar to Nietzsche and the will to power. Like, there is no truth besides that which we basically make for ourselves. What's the quote he uses from Nietzsche? That people who insist they tell the truth long ago forgot they were lying, or something like that, or they started out lying and then stopped remembering. I forget the exact sort of thing, but if you've read like Nietzsche's On Truth and Lie in a non-moral sense, or you've slogged your way through Zarathustra, or any variety of Nietzsche texts, this is a consistent theme. That invention is what matters. There's good and bad, but there's not good and evil. These are things we invent. And Wells really goes for this with the movie F for Fake, which gets mistranslated in the book as It's All True.
Right, and you mentioned that when we did our Once on the Movement image, that translators really screw that up.
Well, okay, so I got curious about this, and I looked at a French copy of Cinema 2, and Deleuze uses the wrong title. So they've translated Deleuze's title for the movie.
Why would he have used the wrong title?
I don't know. I think he might have been writing from memory and just didn't check his source.
Screwed it up.
Yeah.
Just, whatever. The title doesn't... Really a real Persian. Whatever.
Yeah.
It's okay.
But the movie he's talking about when he says It's All True is F for Fake, which is Wells's documentary about art forgery that ends with this fun story about Picasso that turns out not to be true.
Sure.
And it's all about just playing with the idea that truth is constructed and things like that. And, if we think about Wells's film adaptation of The Trial, what it shows us is that the law is arbitrary. It's pursued for its own sake. There's no passage which shows that Joseph K. is guilty. He is just guilty.
Yeah.
Arbitrarily. So again, the law is made and enforced, but it doesn't, there's nothing inherently true to it. So that's why Wells is so important to this idea of forgery. And I guess the most positive forger is kind of Falstaff in Chimes at Midnight, based on Shakespeare's Falstaff plays Henry IV Part 2 and Henry V. Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 and Henry V?
No idea.
I should know this. Anyway, Chimes at Midnight. It's absolutely brilliant. And Falstaff is constantly just a character who spins tall tales, and he isn't quite welcome in proper society, but he's still a knight, and he teaches Prince Hal about the other side, and so he sort of makes himself into this quasi-mythical figure, even though he's a bit of a philanderer and
Sure.
everything. So yeah, but he's more of a comical character. But again, he kind of has to be left behind in the end once Prince Hal becomes King Henry V. I do know that. Falstaff is cast out because he is sort of deceitful, and he taught him everything he needed to know to become king, but he has no place in the court. So that's the Wells stuff with forgery, and Wells and Nietzsche are kind of aligned here, which is kind of interesting if you think about Deleuze's chronologies. So Eisenstein is Hegel, Wells is Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Who's gonna be Deleuze?
I don't know. Who is gonna be Deleuze?
We'll get there. So part 3 of this chapter on forgery and the powers of the false, he talks about documentaries, and particularly 2 filmmakers. He talks about Jean Rouch and Pierre Perrault, who we should really know more about. Pierre Perrault, he's a French-Canadian filmmaker. He made tons of documentaries about...
I'm from the La Belle Province,
yeah.
I should know.
His films are about... What would you call them? Quebecois communities, particularly very deeply entrenched ones. Not... They're like fishers and hunters and things like that. Very provincial sort of Quebecois heritage. Not
les pêcheurs, les chasseurs. Well, that's specifically fishers and hunters, but I don't know if there's a specific name for country folk.
Because I don't want to say indigenous it's Quebecois because that's not what I mean.
I don't know. Les paysans, maybe. Les gens pays de la nation de Québec.
Yeah, that's it though. That's his thing. It's very much the nation of Quebec within Canada as its own nation.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised if his work is kind of controversial because it might have a like really big separatist undercurrent to it.
Maybe.
Because I think it like sees English Canada as like a colonial power over
I said
the
La
Québécois.
Nation. It might have been La Nation Québec. I don't know.
And it's usually feminine, right?
I don't. My French is garbage.
Yeah, mine's not much better. So, but what Deleuze is getting at in this section, after our brief digression on what bad Canadians we are, is that these documentary filmmakers really occupy and create a place for their subjects to express themselves and create their nations. So for Rausch, these are ethnographic studies of French Africans or Africans of French descent and things like that. And the sort of dialectic that takes place between what it means to be an integrated member of French society but also still belong to these other cultures.
Right.
And for Perrault, it's what it means to be a French-speaking subject as a minority in Canada. It's as part of Quebec. So the forging that's taking place there is a forging of an identity between the filmmaker and these people and giving them a place to speak through them. Mm-hmm. And so here is the first time, I think, in this book that we see the return of the idea of free and direct discourse that we talked about with Cinema 1.
Right.
So that, yes, it is the subject, the documentary filmmaker, who is speaking, but who he's filming also speaks through him. So that the voice is neither one nor the other. It moves through both of them. And this is also what Deleuze says is a kind of forgery. Because the subject and object disappear. And then I think it's the end of this chapter. Or it might have been at the end of the section on Wells, but he talks about the difference between the forger and the true creative artist. And so the forger only sort of creates an imitation, but the artist like really invents something. Okay, this is in the Wells section because he's talking about F for Fake and the art forgery. The art forger can recreate a Rembrandt, but it's Rembrandt who really made something, who created a world.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think with the documentary stuff, you get closer to really creating a world. These characters aren't forgers in the manipulative sense like Wells's characters. These are people forging a nation.
Yeah.
Through their stories and the ethnographies of the filmmakers and stuff like that. And so he talks about the meaning of cinema verite.
Yeah.
And how, like, what gives it its name is not any claim to realism, but in giving a space over to these real people and their experiences. And, like, that's what also makes it direct cinema, is the free and direct sort of discourse of it. And yeah, so that's the powers of the false. The power to invent is really the, if we go back to our conspiracy framing of it, then something that gives us a way out of the world of cliche.
And of, like, money.
Yeah.
Time equals money.
Yeah, and out of money's restrictions and its forces is the ability to create or to counterfeit, to make more money
right.
without producing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know how you provide a literal example of that in cinema, but theoretically speaking,
yeah.
to make more out of something than what you're given is a mode of resistance.
Yeah.
And it requires invention. And just being limited or limiting yourself and letting another's perspective takes your place opens onto a power to resist, a power to think, to dive into time and thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's good.
I need to take a break.
Yeah. That's a good place to take a break. All right. Thanks for listening this far. We'll tune in next week. you should, well, not we, you'll tune in next week for, we'll probably conclude it. 7, 8, 9. We could probably do that next week. And then, yeah, great. Thanks for listening this far, and we'll catch you next time. Peace out.